Welcome to LSAT Unplugged.
Thanks a lot for having me, Steve.
Thanks so much for joining. So I was really interested to speak with you because I found you on YouTube. I saw that you're running the Law Simplified YouTube channel and you're sharing lots of great law study tips for students all over the world studying the British Commonwealth system. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting because I'm familiar with the American system only. And I know that a lot of students abroad, especially outside the US, are thinking, where might they want to study law? What are the pros and cons of studying in one country versus another? And what actually is the Commonwealth system of law like? And so I'm hoping you can speak to that a little bit. But first, maybe you just want to share a little bit about your YouTube channel, what you're up to, and how you got into this.
Yeah, so as you rightly said, I have a YouTube channel and a platform known as the Law Simplified. It actually started off, frankly, it started off with the fact that I did an LLB about 5 years ago, and I wasn't actually using my LLB as such, but I used a technique to study myself, and I had a bunch of notes that were in my attic, just collecting dust. So essentially, I thought I'll sort of share it with the world to see if others, it might be helpful to others as well. So it started off with a YouTube channel, and I made a bunch of courses on Udemy as well. So today, I have about 40,000 subscribers on the Law Simplified YouTube channel. I'm teaching roughly 15,000 plus students as of today on Udemy. They're from 170 odd countries. I also conduct master classes on a daily basis for students all around the world. This was somewhat part-time for me, and now it's completely full-time because it's taken up, or it's eaten into most of my time, ideally. And over the past 5 years, I've actually got to teach about 14 different subjects, which is, again, a drop in the ocean compared to the number of subjects that are available for Commonwealth students around the world for the LLB. That's somewhat of a nutshell of Law Simplified.
Wow. So tens of thousands of students all over the world. That's incredible. What do you attribute this to? I mean, it's the law. Maybe it's not the most exciting subject for everyone, but people do need to learn it, of course. And I imagine you're probably making it quite engaging and interesting. How do you think this has grown so much? Why do you think that's happened?
I think the primary reason for the Law Simplified success is I wouldn't say somewhat, it's actually drastically different from the usual university mechanism of a one-sided sort of unidirectional method of teaching. More often than not, I think in terms of the university, they tend to pummel students with a lot of content. So for example, a subject or a subject guide might have 200-300 pages or so. So even before a student even starts the subject, they are overwhelmed. So they're getting into the subject, the text, the material, in a mindset where it's essentially too hard to even fathom. And half of the problem is that actually the perception it creates, all of the content essentially. I've always had this feeling that law is something that you can't relegate in life. It's something that applies to everybody. You can't come to court and say, I didn't know I did something wrong. So essentially, if it applies to everybody, it should be simple enough for everybody to understand. So I had that premise whenever I made courses, and I think that's what really resonates. I have this technique that I use of spider graphs and essentially simplifying, as the name itself suggests. I simplify pretty much everything to the root, to the most common denominator. And I think that's what resonates with students all over the world. And I always say that you can use this just before starting so that you know what you're getting yourself into, or just before sitting for your examination so that you know that what you've learned is essentially what you need at the examination.
Well, I love it. And I'm all about breaking things down, simplifying them as well. And 200 to 300 pages when you're just starting off, I'm sure is quite overwhelming. And if you can break it down much more simply in a YouTube video and just break it down everyday language, I think that is an enormous service to students. So I'm glad that you're doing that. Now, for those who aren't aware, what is an LLB?
So an LLB, or a Bachelor of Laws degree, is an undergraduate degree. It's usually something that many students in Commonwealth countries are familiar with as being able to pursue soon after high school. Essentially, in high school as well, in certain jurisdictions, you do have certain legal modules which account for some of the modules in the LLB first year. And it's usually either a 2 or 3 year LLB, which is a Bachelor of Laws degree. 2 years if you are actually a graduate, because many universities offer the LLB now as a 2-year program. So if you're actually coming in from another background or profession, let's say engineering, marketing, business, accounting, whatever. If you're coming in from that, you'll actually get the opportunity to sit for your LLB within 2 years as opposed to 3. But usually if you are coming in as a high school student, if you're just coming in as an undergraduate, then it's usually a 3-year program with between 9 and 12 subjects, depending on the university you select.
Okay, awesome. Good to know. Now let's say someone is an American. They already did their 4 years of undergrad in the US, and they're thinking maybe they want to get a license to practice law in the UK or a license to practice law in another Commonwealth country. What would they need to do next? Would they need to start over to another undergrad or LLB, or would something else apply?
So that's somewhat of a twofold question, because if you take the LLB, it's an academic qualification as opposed to a professional qualification. So in many jurisdictions, you'll anyway have sort of that boundary where you need to be professionally qualified in order to practice law. What the LLB does is it just gives you a supplement academically. Just because you have an LLB doesn't give you an automatic in to the profession in any jurisdiction, be it the UK, be it Australia, be it Sri Lanka, where I am. It doesn't. It's just an academic qualification. It's just a nice. I wouldn't like to say nice to have, but it doesn't essentially give you that license. So in relation to, I'll take UK because that's like the centerfold for the LLB. In relation to the UK, an LLB would then lead essentially to what is either a BPTC, which is a bar professional training course, which is a vocational part of becoming a barrister, or it will lead to an LPC, which is the law professional course, which leads to you becoming a solicitor. The main difference between those two is a barrister actually appears in court, whereas a solicitor is somewhat of an instructing attorney. It's the person that essentially hires the barrister on your behalf as a client. But those are professional qualifications, which usually students take soon after they finish a 2 or 3 year LLB program. Having said that, there is another qualification known as a GDL, which is the Graduate Diploma in Law. It's essentially a sandwich program for anyone that's interested in practicing law, but do not wish to do an LLB. So let's presume that you have another degree, you're coming in from another profession, another qualification. You can do a GDL, which is usually 9 months to 1 year in duration. And soon after that, you are able to pursue your vocational training in the BPTC, which is the Bar Professional Training Course.
Oh, good to know. So let's say, just to break it down, if someone already had a JD, which is the American law degree, graduate level, they could then go to the UK and they wouldn't have to start from scratch. They could just do these professional courses, one of the BPTC or the other one, or even just the sandwich course, and they wouldn't need to start from the beginning.
That's right. So in essence, you'll anyway have to do the GDL. If you're coming in from a JD, you do a GDL and then the BPTC. You can't just get into the BPTC unless you are a qualified lawyer in another jurisdiction, in which case they have, in the UK, there are schemes in which you can transfer some of the credits or some of the qualifications that you have so that you get exemptions into just doing the BPTC.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Very good to know. Now, you broke it down that there's 2 different types of attorneys in the British UK, the Commonwealth system, the barrister and the solicitor. Barrister is in court. Solicitor is someone who hires the barrister on your behalf. Now, what percentage of attorneys are one or the other? Is it pretty even, or is there one that's more common?
I would think that, in terms of numbers, I wouldn't be able to say it fluctuates and it changes over time. But it's pretty even in the sense that you would have essentially the same group of people entering the profession every year, and you split yourselves in the very beginning. So soon after your GDL, you would have to select whether you're doing a BPTC or the LPC. And the universities, there are only 6 colleges which actually provide both the LPC and the BPTC out of all the universities in the UK. So there's a limitation of what the UK Bar Standards Board, the BSB, recognizes as being institutes that are capable of giving this qualification, the professional qualification. So you have whatever the influx that are coming into these 6 or 7 colleges, those would essentially become split into LPC or BPTC. So it's pretty evenly matched, I would say.
And so you have to make a choice at some point which path you want to take.
Essentially, yes. I think from experience, from having taught several GDL students who are pursuing the BPTC route, I think, and this is more of a human aspect of it. There's a perception among students that becoming a barrister is more stressful than that of a solicitor, because you are in court representing someone, and this tends to be more stressful. So sometimes I've encountered students who prefer to go the LPC route, not essentially because they prefer that over BPTC or the becoming a barrister rather. It's just that they feel it's a bit more comfortable, that they don't have that sensibility that they have to represent someone in court.
Well, that's really funny. That's good to know. I often think that so many, at least students I work with, they see media portrayals of courtroom battles and they get really excited that they want to do it sometimes. But then, at least in the American system, actually quite a low percentage of cases actually go to court, and more of it ends up being paperwork. So is the solicitor doing more of the paperwork behind the scenes?
But pretty much, you could say that as well. And I think apart from that, one other major reason is the competition in the UK for barristers is quite high. Because the way it works in the UK specifically is the fact that once you've finished your academics, so let's say the LLB or the GDL, and then you start your vocational training, that usually goes on for about a year. And pursuant to that, you have to secure what is known as a pupillage in the UK. So you have to get a chamber to essentially give you an offer to apprentice for them, to work for them, to intern for them, and then 6 months down the line, there's a lot of pomp and pageantry in the UK. So you have to go for dinners. There's a number of dinners that you have to complete. You have to be part of one of the Inns of Court. So there's a lot of tradition involved. And having said that, it's very, very difficult to get pupillage, number one, and then get confirmed afterwards, because pupillage is just part of the battle won. You still have to, perform and get an opportunity to be made permanent in that chamber. And I think in terms of being a solicitor or barrister, from the insight that I have from my students, the outcome of becoming a solicitor is far more concrete than that of becoming a barrister.
Wow. Sounds quite difficult. So this pupillage is kind of like finding someone to be a mentor or someone to intern under. Is that kind of what it's like to get real world experience?
Essentially, yeah. They would have to essentially find a chamber, because now it's very rare that you'll have a solo barrister that takes you under their wing and then trains you essentially. You would have to find a chamber. So once you find a chamber, they'll interview you. You'll have to go to several chambers essentially. You'll very rarely, unless you're like absolutely exceptional, that you'll get confirmed in the first chamber that you go to. But essentially, you'll need to make that leap, and you need to show your academic qualifications. You need to make sure that you've performed well in your vocational part of your BPTC and so on. So yeah, it's not an easy road ahead.
No, it sounds like it's not. So a chamber is like a group of attorneys. Is it a law firm, like a private law firm?
I think a chamber is essentially a law firm.
Okay,
that's equivalent to that. Yes.
Okay, great. Good to know. Now, what's the admissions process like for each of these stages? We talked about the later stage, which is the pupillage part and all these dinners and such, but earlier, for what's it like to apply for the undergraduate LLB, and then what's it like to apply for these other the acronyms like the BPTC and these other ones, the GDL, all those. How do you get into each of those stages? So
I would say the easier one of the two, that in the sense of the LLB or the BPTC, would obviously be the LLB. Usually there is a minimum requirement for entering the LLB, and those also separate for local students, UK and EU students, and international students. So if your first language isn't English, for example, you have certain requirements. You have to fulfill either TOEFL or IELTS, a certain bracket based on the university. And once that is done, if you have done, let's say in your high school, if you have done London advanced level law, you have a higher likelihood of being entered into the LLB straight off. Otherwise, there might be an interview process. It's just like applying for a normal university. So there's an application process, there is a mission statement, all of that. It's just the same requirements. once, I think the most important thing to understand is you need to know exactly, even at the very inception, you need to know what exactly you want to do with your law degree. 9 out of 10 times the students I encounter, they do law because they want to be a lawyer. But I always say that that's not sufficient, specifically in the Commonwealth system. At least now, it's not enough for you to know, okay, I want to do law, I want to be in this profession. It's always good to know exactly which area of law you'd like to end up in. The reason for that is when you are looking towards pupillage, at that point, you're obviously going to select a chamber or a law firm that specializes in that area which you want to go for. But if you had not planned that during your LLB or your degree stage, the university that you select might not be recognized or known for that area of law. So when you go towards a pupillage, when you're seen as coming into that with a specialization, yet your degree is from somewhere else, chances are if there's another competitor applicant who is coming from there, he'll get the cut. You won't make the cut. So the first thing I always say is make sure you know which area you want to go. Not just in terms of civil or criminal, but is it intellectual property? Is it ADR? Is it wills? Is it trust law? What is it? Just figure that out, and then only you sort of select the university. Once you do that, it's just, I wouldn't say smooth sailing, but from that point onwards, it's all about finding out the best route that you can take. So if you're someone who's just coming from a high school, you have no choice. You'll still have to go through the 3-year process. If you do have another degree under your belt, then look for a university that provides a 2-year LLB. I don't think it's right of me to mention certain universities because then it seems like an endorsement as such, but there are several universities that offer 2-year LLB programs, which makes the route somewhat shorter.
Yeah, of course. No, that sounds like a great option. Now, let's say someone had chosen to specialize, they not only civil or criminal, of course, but then let's say they chose intellectual property. And they decide after they get accepted by a chamber, they start practicing, and then they find that they don't like it. What do they do at that point when they found that the practice of that specialization just isn't working for them and they might want to switch gears to a different area?
So I would suggest if you have finished your LLB, the best option that you have would be to find out an institute or a college that provides additional support in relation to different courses, because you can supplement your LLB by taking postgraduate sort of diploma, so to speak, in different areas of law. So those are short courses that technically become part of your qualification as well. But I think if you have chosen a path, let's say at the LLB stage of, let's say, intellectual property, that's not really a deal breaker because it will only account for one subject out of like 12. It'll just mean that you've done intellectual property. You're really in trouble if later on you're trying to do a postgraduate degree like an LLM and you're specializing in intellectual property. And afterwards you realize, like halfway down the line, you realize, okay, this is IP is not for me. I don't really feel like doing it. Then you're kind of in trouble because you've specialized in that area at that point. LLB, it's just going to be another subject that you're doing.
Right. Now, let's say, why might someone want to do an LLM and what's the investment involved in doing that?
So an LLM essentially can range anything from £7,000 up to £20,000, depending on the university that you're going for. That would be roughly about $12,000 to about 30-something thousand US, something like that. And it's usually a 2-year program, 2-year LLM. There are 1-year LLMs as well. But not 1 year, as in 1.5 years, about 16 months or so. The advantage there is in terms of what you can achieve career-wise is recognition. So if you are going into a law firm, let's say with not just an LLB, but an LLM under your belt, your chances are far much higher, especially if you're going to a firm which is specializing in the area that you have an LLM in.
Okay, great. Good to know. But if they only see the LM, but they don't see any practical work experience, could that have an impact? Would you want to get work experience before you advance through your education with the LLM?
I think this is somewhat of a vicious cycle, right? So it's you need experience to get to work, but then you need work to get experience. So this is an unfortunate situation, but I think you're right in the sense that it's always better to have some work experience, some years under your belt before you actually do an LLM. But I think from what I've seen in terms of like the feedback that I get from most students, like over the past 6 months, I think I would have done master classes, which is essentially one-on-ones for about close to 30 to 35 students from the UK alone. So in that context, half of those who have done those master classes are actually professionals. And interestingly, there are people who are changing careers. So you have people who, for example, who is in pharmaceuticals, who is turning into law. And what I've noticed is they tend to try to quickly do the GDL and get the professional qualification in place rather than really do an LLM. So in response to your question, I think it's always in terms of practicality, I think do some work, then sort of supplement with an LLM.
Thanks. That's good to know. And just to touch on the employment situation a little bit, what is the employment situation currently like, primarily, I suppose, in the UK?
So I'm in relation to barristers or solicitors?
Both.
Okay, so I wouldn't be able to tell you in numbers as such because I'm not on the mainland. But essentially what happens is there's always a demand for both solicitors and barristers that are constant. It's just that there is a sort of a limitation in the number of firms that can accommodate the demand, or rather the supply that's coming out of these Inns of Court or from these universities. I would think right now the trend actually would be, rather than practice as such, to be a specialized lawyer that's more geared towards alternative dispute resolution. Because in terms of mediation, in terms of arbitration, there's a lot of opportunities that are opening up, not just in the UK, but in places such as Singapore, for instance. And you see a lot of people trying to specialize, at least from a LLM perspective, into that area so that they can move into that, because there's a lot of opportunities opening up there.
Oh, that's great advice. ADR, alternative dispute resolution. Very, very good to know. But that's also becoming more popular in the US as well. So thanks for sharing that. Now, this has been so informative, Shabin. Thank you so much for sharing your time. Before we sign off, do you want to share a little bit about, again, what's your channel about and your master classes and any other resources and instruction you have?
Sure. So the Law Simplified program, which I run, focuses primarily on Bachelor of Laws or LLB degrees. But essentially, it's a channel and it's a platform that allows any student who's interested in doing the LLB to find out what they're getting themselves into, first of all, and perhaps even someone who is somewhat stuck in their degree. So maybe they're in a university or they've just started their course, to have a look at the road ahead. And it provides sort of academic support, it provides career guidance, and there's always opportunities for one-on-one master classes as well, where I teach the subjects. And yeah, I think you'll give a shout out to the channel as well. So I don't need to say much more than that.
Great. Thank you so much, Shabin. I'll make sure to link the channel and any other links you have for me in the show notes or that description below this episode. Thank you again so much for joining. Really appreciate your taking the time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, Steve.